On an August evening in 2010, 36-year-old Rusty Snyderman could barely contain his excitement as he talked to a small group of people in his kitchen in Dunwoody, Georgia, an upscale suburb of Atlanta. Rusty and his wife Andrea had some friends over, and people were spread out across the large suburban home, laughing, eating, and drinking. But in the kitchen, Rusty was talking to Hemi Newman, who was his wife's boss, along with a couple other friends, about a new business that Rusty was launching. Rusty was lanky with short brown hair, and he could barely see without his glasses on. And when he talked about something that he was passionate about, he used his whole body. And Rusty was very passionate about this new business idea, so he was very animated as he spoke. He told his captive audience that his idea was to start a company that provided celebrity voicemail services. So basically, somebody could pay a famous actor or singer or athlete to create the outgoing voicemail message on the person who was paying's phone, or a friend's phone as a gift or something like that. To make this more clear, if I were to pay for this, I would have a voicemail that would say, "Hey, you've reached the voicemail of John Allen. Leave a message after the beep." But instead of it being my voice, it would be some celebrity saying as much. Now, remember, this was several years before celebrity video services like Cameo would come out, so the people listening to this idea had never heard of anything like this before, and they thought it was absolutely brilliant. Hemi, who was an executive at General Electric, which is a big appliance company, liked the idea, but did raise some questions about overhead costs and stuff like that, and the other people that were listening, Rusty's friends, they wanted to know how would he get these famous people on board with the concept. And Rusty, who people said was a born entrepreneur, had an answer for all their questions. And he really believed that if he did this right, the company would grow and it would even become something potentially that was so big and successful that he could pass it down to his kids. And so as Rusty was talking about his big plan, his wife Andrea stepped into the kitchen and overheard what they were talking about, and she quickly kind of chimed in that, maybe if this business is as successful as Rusty thinks, they wouldn't even need to worry about their kids' future job prospects. Their 5-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son would be just set because of this great business. And even though she was sort of joking about this, being so committed to this totally succeeding, there was some truth to that. She really believed this was going to be a success, same as Rusty. But Andrea's excitement was more about her husband having something to focus on rather than the actual company he was going to build. Andrea had known Rusty had a great mind for business since they started dating back in college at the University of Indiana. And not long after graduating, Andrea had moved with Rusty while he earned a master's degree from Harvard Business School. They had gotten married soon after that, moved to Georgia when Rusty got a job offer, and they started their family. And initially, things went great for Rusty on the work front. A few years earlier, in 2007, he'd gotten a job as the chief financial officer for a large chain of daycares, and he was making a ton of money. But over the last year, Rusty had begun clashing with the men who owned the company, and so they ultimately fired him. And that had changed everything back at their home. Andrea, who had always been kind of a math whiz, went ahead and got a job, and a really good one, a well-paying job at GE to support the family, and Rusty, who was now out of work, became a stay-at-home dad. Andrea knew Rusty did not resent her at all, even though her job often required her to travel a lot and leave him alone with the kids, but she also knew Rusty loved working. And so now that he had this new idea for this celebrity voicemail company, she just felt like he seemed so much happier and in such a better place, way better than he had been over the past couple of months. In the kitchen, Andrea grabbed a soda out of the fridge and asked her boss and Rusty's friends if they needed anything. They said they were fine, so Andrea said okay. She turned around and headed into the other room to speak to some of the other guests. Later that night, after all the guests had gone, Rusty and Andrea cleaned up the house, and as they did, they talked about what a great time they'd had. They also got excited discussing an upcoming cruise they were going on in a few months, just the two of them. Their kids would be with their grandparents, and so Rusty and Andrea would finally have time to reconnect, just the two of them. Even though things had been kind of tough the last few months, they both felt good about where their lives were heading. And to their surprise, they actually felt sort of lucky to live in this town of Dunwoody, Georgia. Rusty and Andrea had grown up in the Midwest of the United States, and they had really worried they wouldn't fit in when they moved here to the South. But over the years, Dunwoody had proven to be the perfect place for them. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in this beautiful secluded neighborhood that backed right up to sprawling woods filled with oak and pine trees. And they were close enough to Atlanta to also enjoy all the city had to offer as well. But most importantly, to Rusty and Andrea, Dunwoody had a tight, supportive Jewish community, which was not the case for a lot of suburbs in the area. Rusty and Andrea credited the Jewish community for helping them adjust to life in the South, and for weathering challenges like when Rusty had lost his job. So Dunwoody felt like home, a great town to raise their kids in, and the right place for Rusty to launch this next phase of his career. But a little later that night, as Rusty worked on his business proposal at the kitchen table, something so strange, almost completely unbelievable, was happening in Dunwoody. It was something that nobody who lived in the small suburb would have ever imagined. A few minutes from Rusty and Andrea Snyderman's house, a driver sat in their parked car on the side of a neighborhood street. The car felt ice cold, but sweat dripped down the driver's face. They could feel their chest getting tight, and they heard this loud rumbling sound coming from their passenger seat. The driver shook their head. "Please don't let this happen to me again." But there was nothing the driver could do. The car rattled, a light flashed outside, and then the demon appeared in the passenger seat. The driver tried to hide their eyes, but they couldn't look away, like the demon was forcing the driver to stare at it. The demon's head nearly touched the roof of the car, and its legs were massive. It wore a dark cloak and hood, and when the driver looked at it, they felt like all hope inside of them was just draining away. The demon turned its head away from the driver and began to talk. Its voice was deep and powerful. The driver thought the demon actually sounded like the 1970s soul and R&B singer Barry White, who was famous for songs like "Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Babe." The driver trembled, but the demon said there was no need to be afraid. The driver had been chosen to carry out a mission. The driver begged the demon to please leave them alone, but the demon said the mission was too important to ignore. Suddenly, the whole car shook and light flooded in from all sides. The driver shielded their eyes again, but they also felt a perfect sense of calm coming over them. They looked back at the passenger seat, and now the demon was gone. In its place sat an angel wrapped in light. The angel spoke, and the driver thought immediately that it sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, the actress and singer who had starred in movie musicals like Grease and Xanadu. When the angel spoke, they said the driver really was the only one who could carry out this very important mission the demon had already mentioned. So the driver asked, "What's the mission?" The angel smiled and said members of the Snyderman family were in grave danger, and the driver had to protect them. On the morning of November 10th, so about 3 months after the angel and demon appeared in that driver's car, Andrea rushed into her kitchen holding her 5-year-old daughter's hand. Rusty was in the kitchen helping their son finish his breakfast. Andrea and her daughter both gave Rusty a kiss and told him they'd see him later, and then they headed out to the garage. Whenever Andrea was not traveling, she always made a point to drive her daughter to kindergarten on her way to work. It was just another way for her to bond with her child. After they were gone, Rusty's son finished eating, and Rusty cleaned up the kitchen and then got his son dressed for preschool. At about 8:30 a.m., Rusty carried his son out to the silver Infiniti car parked in the garage, opened up the garage door, and then buckled the boy into his car seat in the back. But before Rusty closed the car door, he hesitated. A strange smell was coming from outside. Rusty couldn't tell if it was gasoline or something else, so he walked out of the garage and scanned the yard, and he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. Rusty turned to the side of the house, and he saw someone laying in the grass. He didn't know if this person was sleeping or hurt or what was going on, so he just shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" The person jumped up and just stared at Rusty. It was a man with a thick black mustache, and he wore a wool hat and earmuffs. Rusty immediately felt like something is wrong with this person, so he turned, ran back into his garage, hopped in the car, locked the doors, and then he pulled out into the street with his little son in back. And then, as Rusty began to drive away, he looked and saw this man with the earmuffs running down a long path that led to the woods behind the cul-de-sac. Rusty had no idea what any of this meant, so he just grabbed his phone and called 911. When the emergency operator picked up, Rusty told them what he had just seen and gave as good of a description as he could of the man with the earmuffs. Rusty also said he thought he smelled something like gasoline outside of his house right before he saw this guy. The operator told Rusty they would send a police unit over right away to look around, and Rusty said, okay, great, but he still had to drive his son to school, but right after that, he would come back home and be ready to talk to police. A few minutes later, Rusty arrived at the preschool and walked his son inside, and then afterward, he headed right back home. And when he got there, police officers, firefighters, and a workman from the gas company were all arriving as well. Rusty told his story to the police again, and they said other officers were already out looking for this man he described. Then, the gas company employee said Rusty's house did have a gas leak, but nothing had been tampered with. Whoever had been at the house in the front yard didn't appear to have caused the leak. It was just an odd coincidence. And the guy said he had fixed the leak already, and the gas company employee said, the leak was a very easy fix. Later that day, after all the emergency personnel and the gas company employee were all gone, Rusty still didn't have any real answers about who the heck that guy was. Officers said that, the guy with the earmuffs could have been a homeless person sleeping near his house, but that made no sense to Rusty. Things like that just didn't happen in this neighborhood. But police had said that until they found this guy with the earmuffs and the mustache, there really wasn't much they could do. So that night, when Andrea came home and Rusty filled her in about this guy, they talked about it and just said, all we can do is be super vigilant whenever they left the house. And they said they would do their best not to worry too much. They didn't want the kids to get a sense that their parents were scared of something. But Rusty admitted he was glad that he and Andrea were leaving town for their cruise soon, and that the kids would not be at the house either. They'd be with their grandparents. And Rusty hoped that, by the time they all came back home after the cruise, things would be back to normal in the neighborhood. Meaning, the guy with the earmuffs and the mustache has been found, and hopefully will not be back anytime soon. 8 days later, at 9 a.m. on November 18th, Rusty pulled up to his son's preschool. Rusty and Andrea had gotten back from their cruise a couple of days earlier, and Rusty felt rejuvenated. And nothing strange had happened at the house since they'd returned, so he hoped that the man lying in the grass was just some weird one-time occurrence. Rusty unbuckled his son from the car seat and led him into the preschool. And then Rusty chatted with a few other parents who were also doing drop-offs, and then a few minutes later, Rusty was headed back towards his car. However, when Rusty reached his car and opened up the driver's side door, he suddenly heard footsteps, and he glanced over his shoulder, and he saw a man with brown hair and a beard walking quickly towards him. Seconds later, screams rang out in the preschool parking lot as a silver minivan peeled out and sped away. One of the other parents ran over to Rusty's car where the scream had come from. The driver's side door was still open, and Rusty lay on the ground in a pool of blood. The woman could see Rusty was still breathing, so she screamed for help and then called 911. In the shopping center right next to the preschool, a woman happened to see what was going on, and so she immediately ran into a doctor's office that happened to be nearby. And right away, a doctor and a nurse darted out of that office, and they ran over to Rusty. The doctor quickly checked Rusty's pulse and then began administering CPR. And soon, the doctor heard an ambulance siren wailing down the street. By this time, people from inside the preschool who heard all this commotion had began running outside into the parking lot. But luckily, all of the children were outside behind the school and had no idea what was happening, including Rusty's son. The ambulance arrived and paramedics took over for the doctor, trying to keep Rusty alive. They got Rusty onto a gurney, into the ambulance, and then they sped towards the hospital. A few minutes later, Detective Andrew Thompson of the Dunwoody Police Department arrived at the preschool. He saw a few of his fellow officers trying their best to keep a growing crowd away from Rusty's car. Detective Thompson had been a cop in Atlanta for 8 years before moving here to Dunwoody, but he'd only been a detective for about 2 years. And he'd also never been the lead investigator on a potential homicide, and he knew that's what he had on his hands right now. Thompson got out of his car, he briefly spoke with the officers on site, and then began taking witness statements. The few people who had seen what happened all said the same thing. A man with brown hair and a beard stepped out of a silver minivan, walked right up to Rusty Snyderman, and shot him multiple times. Then the man with the beard got back in the minivan and drove off. Other than the man having a beard, the witnesses didn't notice anything that stood out about the shooter's appearance. But one witness said the shooter seemed remarkably calm considering what he did. He walked up calm as can be, shot Rusty, and then turned and calmly walked back to the van before leaving. Detective Thompson thanked all the witnesses for their help and then kind of gently told them to please step back, and then he and the other officers began searching the area right around Rusty's car. A trail of blood now stretched out almost 40 feet across the parking lot. And to the side of the blood trail near the car, the police found 4 brass bullet casings that they believed were fired from a semi-automatic .40 caliber or .44 caliber weapon. And then, not long after Thompson and the others had found these bullet casings, Thompson got word that Rusty had unfortunately passed away at the hospital. Thompson was now officially leading a homicide investigation for the first time. While Detective Thompson searched the preschool parking lot for more evidence, Rusty's wife, Andrea, sat at her desk in GE's Atlanta offices. A minute later, her phone rang, and she noticed the call was coming in from her son's preschool. And so Andrea immediately answered, and the preschool administrator on the other line sounded very upset. She said Andrea's son was just fine, but Andrea needed to come to the school immediately. So without thinking, Andrea grabbed her things and ran outside to her car, and as she was running towards it, she pulled out her phone and called her boss Hemi to let him know she was dealing with some kind of an emergency, and then she got in her car and sped back towards the suburbs. As soon as Andrea pulled into the preschool parking lot, she saw all these police officers who turned and looked at her, and immediately they walked right up to her, and so she rolled her window down, and they said, "You have to go to the hospital right now." Andrea demanded to know what was going on. Was her son really okay? And the police assured her her son was absolutely safe, but she still needed to go to the hospital right now. And when Andrea arrived at the hospital a few minutes later, there she would learn her husband had been gunned down in the preschool parking lot and had died shortly after. Detective Thompson spent most of the day in the preschool parking lot, working with the forensics team to see if there was any useful evidence they could find beyond just the bullet casings. But they didn't find much of anything else. So Thompson knew his biggest clues right then were that the killer had a beard and drove a silver minivan. None of the witnesses had gotten the license plate of this silver minivan, but Thompson had already called in an alert, so all the police departments in the area would be on the lookout for any vehicle that could possibly be a match. Thompson also arranged for a forensic sketch artist to meet with the witnesses and make a composite drawing of the shooter from all of their descriptions. By the time the sun set, Thompson already felt tired and a little overwhelmed, but he had no intention of stopping. So he got in his car and drove to Andrea and Rusty's house. Once he got there and parked his car, he stepped outside into the cool fall air. It was just above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And just a second later, he heard somebody calling his name. Thompson looked over and saw his boss, Sergeant Gary Cordellino, standing by his own car at the curb. Cordellino still wanted Thompson to take the lead on this case, but he knew the detective did not have a lot of experience working homicide cases, so he said he would just be there to help. Thompson thanked Cordellino for coming, and the two men walked up to the house together. Cordellino's strong New York accent was a major contrast to the soft southern drawl a lot of people in town spoke with. But just like Rusty and Andrea, Cordellino had come to consider this small town in Georgia home, even if he was originally an outsider from up north. Andrea opened up the front door, and it was clear she'd been crying. The detectives introduced themselves and asked if they could please come inside. But Andrea got a stern look on her face. She said her parents and her in-laws were there, and this was a house of mourning. She thought it was very disrespectful that the police would want to intrude so soon after her husband had died. But Detective Thompson was just not going to have this. He said they were investigating a murder, and they needed to ask her and the family some questions right now. But Andrea just repeated herself. The family was in mourning, and they had no intention of speaking to police right now. At this point, Thompson got an angry look on his face, and he was about to push Andrea further, but Sergeant Cordellino jumped in. He said they were very sorry for her and her family's loss, and then apologized to Andrea for disturbing her and her family at such a difficult time, and said they would come back the following day. Andrea's face softened, and then she thanked him and said she would be willing to talk to them tomorrow. She closed the door, and then the two detectives walked back towards their respective cars. Thompson couldn't believe what had just happened. Clearly, they needed to interview the victim's wife, like right now. But Cordellino told him that in his experience, grief could do some really strange things to people, and they were way better off not pushing Andrea right at this moment. Still, Cordellino did admit that it was worth noting that Andrea did not seem remotely eager to help. The following day, November 19th, 2010, Detective Thompson and Sergeant Cordellino returned to Andrea and Rusty's house, this time with a warrant to search the premises. Andrea still did not seem thrilled to have the police in her home, and she thought the warrant was totally unnecessary, but she still led them into the kitchen, and she and her family sat down and spoke to them. Over the course of about 2 hours, the detectives met with Andrea, her parents, Rusty's parents, and his brother. And they all pretty much said the same thing. Rusty was a great guy, people who knew him loved him, and they just couldn't imagine who would want to hurt him. This didn't surprise Thompson and Cordellino. Families often painted their dead relatives in the best possible light. It's just what you do, it's your family. Andrea told the detectives she couldn't think of anybody who fit the description of the bearded man that witnesses had seen. Then after she said it, she immediately shook her head like she had just remembered something. She said in all of the chaos and grief, she'd almost forgotten something really huge. The detectives asked what she meant, and Andrea said about a week earlier, Rusty had seen this weird guy with earmuffs on and a mustache laying in their front yard for no reason right as he was taking their son to school. Rusty had been so freaked out by seeing this guy who kind of inexplicably ran away that he called the police and gave a description of the guy. And again, part of that description was saying that this guy had this big black mustache. Thompson and Cordellino looked at each other. It was definitely possible the man with the big mustache and the earmuffs had grown out a full beard, and then by the time he was shooting Rusty, that's what you saw, his full beard, and not just a mustache. So maybe the shooter really was the same person Rusty had seen in the front yard. They talked to Andrea a bit longer, and then at some point they told her they wanted to take her and Rusty's computers to be searched. And again, Andrea got very upset. Detective Thompson thought it was strange that she still seemed unwilling to do whatever it took to help police find her husband's killer. But the detectives, in truth, did not really need Andrea to give them permission because they had a warrant. So they took the computers, then they thanked Rusty's family for talking to them, and then they left. Back at the station, Thompson and Cordellino handed off the computers for forensic data analysis, and then they dug up the report Rusty had filed about this weird guy he'd seen in his front yard. At that point, the detectives only knew there was a guy with this big mustache who might also be the big bearded guy who shot Rusty. It was not much to go on, and nobody in Rusty's family or anybody from the preschool remotely recognized this bearded guy. Then, something came to Thompson. He remembered what one of the witnesses had said, that the shooter seemed to be utterly calm when he walked up and shot and killed Rusty. And so Thompson floated the idea that, what if the shooter was a professional hitman who somebody had hired to kill Rusty? That would make sense because nobody would know who he was, and maybe he was wearing a disguise or something, and he certainly would be very calm walking up to do the killing because this is what he did professionally. And surprisingly, Cordellino did not think this was a far-fetched idea at all. In fact, he said, if this guy Rusty saw in the yard was also the shooter, this hitman potentially, he could have been at the house that day tracking Rusty's movements and learning his routines, something a professional killer would likely do. And when the detectives began delving into emails and other information they had found on Rusty and Andrea's computers, the hired killer theory only began to make more sense. The detectives found that during his time working as a chief financial officer, Rusty had clashed repeatedly with the business owners. And based on the emails, he and Andrea were not shy about telling other people exactly how they felt about those men. Also, since Rusty had begun working on creating his own company, the Celebrity Voicemail Company, he'd worked closely with a business partner as well as several potential investors. So there was a chance that maybe Rusty had just angered the wrong people when talking trash about his former bosses, or maybe he'd had a financial dispute with someone who was working with him on his new business. The detectives kept digging into Rusty and Andrea's computer data, but they also knew they could break everything wide open if they could just locate the silver minivan the shooter had been driving. So, with the help of other police departments in the state, they expanded the search radius for this minivan beyond just the Atlanta metropolitan area. And so soon, police were scouring security camera footage from roads and stores surrounding the city. The detectives also put together a list of people who might have had the motive and the money to hire a hitman to take Rusty out. On November 21st, 2010, so 3 days after Rusty's murder, sheets hung over the mirrors in Rusty and Andrea's house, and friends and family sat together on low stools in the front room. Rusty's funeral had taken place earlier that day, and now the people who had been closest to him were sitting Shiva. Shiva is a Jewish tradition in which family and friends gather together to mourn a dead loved one. They'll say prayers and often receive condolence calls from others. At the house, Andrea thanked her boss, Hemi, and her GE coworkers for coming. They had all been so worried about her when she got that call saying something was wrong at her son's preschool, but none of them could have imagined that that call would eventually lead to this. A little while later, Andrea's boss, Hemi, began to lead the whole group in a prayer. Over 100 members of Hemi's extended family had actually died in the Holocaust, and so that had always inspired him to remain an active member of the Jewish community and to provide any help he could to those close to him, like Andrea. But while Andrea was sitting Shiva and listening to Hemi give this prayer, Detective Thompson and Cordellino just could not shake the feeling that Andrea had to be somehow involved in her husband's death. The police were still desperately trying to find the shooter's silver minivan, but their potential hired hitman theory had also led them to delve into Rusty's finances. And they had discovered that Andrea stood to get a $2 million payout from Rusty's life insurance policy. So along with being the murder victim's spouse, which by default made them a huge potential suspect, Andrea also had a clear financial motive to want her husband dead. And on top of that, she really had not seemed like she wanted to cooperate with police. And so the detectives decided they had to speak to Andrea again, but this time they wanted to isolate her from the rest of her family. On November 24th, almost a week after the murder, Thompson and Cordellino sat down with Andrea in an interview room at the police station. Andrea tucked her brown hair behind her ear, adjusted her glasses, and stared across a small white table at the two detectives. Thompson and Cordellino could tell Andrea was all business, and that she still clearly resented having to speak with the police. But they still started by thanking her for coming in, and then they asked her how her relationship had been with her husband prior to his murder. Andrea admitted things had gotten a bit strained between them when Rusty lost his job, but she said they'd worked through that. And other than typical husband and wife arguments, they actually got along really well. Andrea seemed totally matter-of-fact when she answered these questions. On the one hand, the detectives thought that made her seem almost unfeeling about her husband's death, like she didn't care. But Cordellino realized that this was a woman dealing with an impossible situation. Also, she was used to being in high-powered business meetings, so maybe this was just the way she conducted herself. Then, at some point, Cordellino asked Andrea if it was possible that Rusty could have been having an affair. Was there a jealous lover out there who might have had it out for him? But Andrea didn't flinch. She sort of half-smiled and said the idea that Rusty was cheating on her was absurd. He was one of the most loving, supportive people she had ever met. He would never, ever do something like that to their family. So the detectives moved from Andrea and Rusty's personal relationship to their financial situation. But nothing Andrea said indicated that she would have killed Rusty for his life insurance policy. Rusty had put a lot of money away during his time working, and she got paid well at GE, so really, money was not an issue for them. So eventually, the detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked Andrea for her time. But after she left, Thompson and Cordellino felt like they didn't know much more than they did before she showed up. And for the life of them, they could not decide if that was because Andrea really just didn't know anyone who would want to hurt her husband, or if she was hiding something. In the weeks following that interview, no new leads came in, and Thompson and Cordellino began to get frustrated. They still didn't know if the man with the earmuffs and the mustache that Rusty had seen at the house was also the bearded shooter, or if those were two totally different people. And the detectives didn't know if this full bearded shooter had been hired by somebody else, or if it was someone who knew Rusty, that they had somehow overlooked that maybe had a specific reason to attack Rusty. But then, in mid-December, so about a month after Rusty's murder, Detective Thompson was sitting at his desk when one of his team members rushed over to him. And this young cop had a huge smile on his face. Thompson asked him what was going on, and the young cop said he'd been re-watching surveillance footage of the silver minivan as it drove down a street near the preschool. There still was not a clear shot of the license plate, but the young cop had spotted a small white sticker on the van's windshield that nobody had caught before. And he was sure that that was the type of sticker that rental car companies used to track their vehicles. Immediately, Detective Thompson stood up, full of energy. The young cop said, the sticker didn't point to a specific rental car company, but Thompson just put his hand up and said, nope, that doesn't matter. This is a huge discovery. Armed with this new information about this sticker, police reached out to and visited rental car companies all across the area. And after about a week or so of searching, they finally found a silver Kia Sedona minivan at a rental car lot 25 miles north of Dunwoody. And that van could absolutely match the shooter's vehicle. And when they checked that minivan's recent rental history, Thompson and Cordellino immediately recognized the name that came up. And they were sure right then and there they had found Rusty's killer. Based on information from the rental car company, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, this is what police think happened to Rusty Snyderman on the morning of November 18th, 2010. On that day, at about 5:45 a.m., the killer heard the voice of the angel ringing in his head. That voice, that sounded just like Olivia Newton-John, had told the killer that time was running out. People were in danger, and the killer had their marching orders. This mission had to be accomplished now. The killer climbed into a silver minivan and then pulled out into the dark, empty early morning streets. The killer drove slowly, moving from dark to light as the van passed under each street lamp. Finally, they pulled the van onto Rusty and Andrea's street about an hour before the sun would rise. They parked their car a few houses down from Rusty's, and then they waited. But soon, the killer noticed lights turning on in some of the houses as people got ready for work and school and their morning routine. So the killer drove the van out of the neighborhood and found a spot on the street not too far from Rusty's son's preschool. The killer sat in the van, occasionally hearing the sound of the angel's voice encouraging them. And then at some point, the killer leaned over, opened up the glove box, and pulled out a semi-automatic pistol. They checked to make sure the gun was loaded, and when they saw it was, the killer laid down on the passenger seat. As the sun rose, the killer continued to just lay there, breathing very slowly in and out, very rhythmically, to ensure they remained calm. Then finally, around 9 a.m., the killer sat up and saw Rusty's Infiniti driving down the street towards them. The killer let Rusty drive by, and then quickly pulled out of their parking space, and then slowly tailed Rusty all the way to the preschool parking lot, and once they got there, the killer parked a few spaces away from Rusty's car. The killer watched as Rusty led his son into the preschool and began chatting with some parents inside of the doorway. As Rusty did this, the killer grabbed the gun off the passenger seat and held it in their lap. Then, a few minutes later, the killer saw Rusty walking back towards his car. At this point, the killer opened up the minivan door and, calm as can be, walked across the parking lot. Rusty had managed to open up his car door, but by that point, the killer was practically on top of him. The killer got within 3 feet of Rusty, raised their gun, and fired. The bullet struck Rusty on the left side of the jaw, traveling through his right shoulder and then lodged in his back. Rusty immediately collapsed to the ground, blood pouring out of his face and seeping through his shirt. The killer turned to walk back to the minivan, but then quickly wheeled back around and fired 3 more shots into Rusty's abdomen as he lay dying on the asphalt. After that, the killer turned and walked back to the minivan, got in, threw it in reverse, peeled out of the parking space, and then sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, the killer could see people running over to Rusty on the ground, but the killer felt confident they had killed Rusty and that the angel and demon would now be satisfied. A few minutes later, the killer pulled the van out onto a highway and disappeared into traffic. They drove for a while, exited off the highway, and then headed into a town 25 miles away from Dunwoody. There, they drove the van to the rental car company where they had gotten it, and they pulled it into the return lot. They checked the rearview mirror and looked out the windows. Nobody was nearby, so the killer reached up and yanked the brown wig off their head and also peeled the big fake beard off their face. The killer then stuffed the disguise pieces into a bag, got out of their rental car, and walked to a nearby auto repair shop where they had dropped off their real car for a minor repair the day before. The killer quickly paid for the work on their car and then drove off, headed towards General Electric's Atlanta offices. Some members of the investigative team had remained convinced that Rusty's wife Andrea had killed Rusty, but it turned out the shooter was somebody else who worked at GE. Andrea's boss, Hemi Newman. Police had talked to Hemi when they interviewed Andrea's friends and coworkers, but they didn't really focus on him as a potential suspect until they discovered the minivan at the rental car company. Hemi had used his real name to rent that car, and seeing Hemi's name on the rental form led Thompson and Cordellino back to Andrea's computer. And it turned out that she and Hemi had exchanged a number of emails that led police to believe their relationship was far more than just boss and employee. After police traced the rental van to Hemi, they interviewed and then arrested him. But they continued to push Andrea because they believed she and Hemi had worked together to kill Rusty, 2 lovers who wanted to be rid of Andrea's husband. That's when things got really weird. Hemi admitted to being in love with Andrea, and he even suggested that they had had an affair, though Andrea denied it. Still, Hemi said he did not arrange Rusty's murder with Andrea. Instead, he was simply following orders passed down to him from a demon and an angel who happened to sound like popular singers from the 1970s and 1980s. Talking to a psychiatrist, Hemi admitted that the Barry White-sounding demon had been visiting him for decades, dating back to when he was in college. But it was not until that angel appeared to him in the car on the night he had gone to Rusty and Andrea's house, and Rusty had talked about this new idea that he was going to make this company around celebrity voicemails, that Hemi understood his role in the cosmic battle of good versus evil. According to Hemi, the angel told him that Rusty was a threat to Andrea and the kids. In fact, the angel said Hemi was the true father of Andrea's son and daughter. And apparently, Rusty had found this out, this is again according to the angel, and so Rusty was bound to eventually murder his wife and kids as a result. That is, unless Hemi stopped Rusty by killing him first. To carry out this mission, Hemi first bought a big fake black mustache and slapped it on his face along with some earmuffs, and he spied on Rusty at his house. But of course, Rusty caught him laying on the front yard, but Rusty had no idea it was actually Hemi because the disguise worked. And then after that, when Hemi learned Rusty's routine, he bought a different disguise, the wig and the big fake beard, for the day of the murder. In court, Hemi's defense team entered an insanity plea and then proceeded to trace Hemi's complete and disturbed history with this demon and angel. But the prosecution never bought any of this. They remained convinced that Hemi had concocted this whole story to avoid life in prison. They also believed that Andrea Snyderman, not some angel or demon, was the one who actually put Hemi up to murdering her husband. The jury found Hemi guilty of murder, but they also deemed him mentally ill. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and as of 2024, he is incarcerated at the Augusta State Medical Prison. But after Hemi's conviction, police and the DA stayed focused on Andrea. She was eventually arrested and charged with murder, along with multiple other counts. But the murder charge was dropped, and she was never tried in connection to her husband's death. However, Andrea was found guilty on multiple counts that pertained to hindering the murder investigation. Andrea would go on to serve just 22 months of a 5-year prison sentence, and when she got out of prison, she received the $2 million from Rusty's life insurance policy and maintained custody of her 2 kids.
The state of Iowa is known as the corn capital of the world. But Iowa's 3 million residents do a lot more than produce billions of bushels of corn every year. They also personify some of the best qualities that America has to offer. Located in the Midwestern part of the country and surrounded by 2 rivers and 6 other states, the people of Iowa take pride in being friendly, considerate, law-abiding, hardworking, and just plain nice. The state is one of the safest in the country, and every year, national surveys show that Iowa residents are among the most polite Americans you will ever meet. And if there's one place in Iowa where you are guaranteed to be treated, quote, Iowa nice, it's the little town in the southwest corner of the state called Shenandoah. At one time, Shenandoah was considered the seed and nursery capital of the entire world. They no longer hold that title, but residents of this town are still surrounded by some of the most beautiful flowers and trees on the planet, along with some of the best-tasting fruits and vegetables. And back in 1988, if there was one person in Shenandoah who absolutely embodied the town's spirit of friendliness, hospitality, and local pride, it was 39-year-old Cindy Borton. If you were a visitor to Shenandoah back in the late 1980s, Cindy would be one of the first people to run right up to you to introduce herself and offer you directions or recommendations of where to go in her little town. And if you were one of Cindy's friends or neighbors, she would drop anything she was doing to help you, and it didn't matter if it was day or night. Unlike many of the town's 5,500 residents whose family had been living in the town for generations, Cindy and her husband Robert and their son John had moved to Shenandoah later in life. Cindy was born on May 22, 1949, in another small Iowa town called Garwin that was located 3.5 hours to the northeast of Shenandoah. There, she and her brother had grown up playing outside and helping their parents with daily chores. After high school, Cindy went to work at a local restaurant, which is where she met her future husband, Robert. He had grown up in another Iowa town about 30 minutes away from her. Robert was a stocky young man with horn-rimmed glasses and brown hair that he swept back from his receding hairline, and when he met Cindy, he was instantly charmed by the smiling and laughing waitress with thick dark hair and shining eyes. A year after meeting, Cindy and Robert got married, and 1 year after that, they welcomed their first and only child, a baby boy named John. Early on in their marriage, Robert enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and so he was gone a lot of the time. As a result, Cindy stepped up and became the anchor of the family, always putting the needs of her husband and her son over her own. She also began working multiple part-time jobs to supplement Robert's military income, which was just not that much. However, she only took jobs that did not interfere with her ability to spend quality time with her son, John. In 1977, after Robert left the military, the Bortons moved to a town in Illinois called Evanston. There, Robert enrolled in a private seminary so that he could fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming an ordained pastor. In 1981, Robert graduated from the seminary, and a year later, he got an offer from a little church in Shenandoah asking him to come be their pastor. Robert and Cindy were thrilled, and so after Robert accepted the offer, the little family packed up their belongings and then made the 8-hour trip west back to their home state of Iowa and into the pretty little town of Shenandoah. Once in Shenandoah, Cindy immediately threw herself into her new role as the pastor's wife. She was naturally outgoing and empathetic, and so she pretty much instantly became a favorite, not just with Robert's congregation, but with the rest of the town as well. Even though Robert had landed his dream job, it was not a high-paying job, and so like Cindy, he needed to go out and pick up some extra work to make ends meet. Robert would get a part-time job at a car dealership where he washed and cleaned cars, and Cindy, after arriving in Shenandoah, worked as many as 3 part-time jobs, including her main one at a donut shop. But despite how much Cindy and Robert were forced to work every week, they were very happy people. In fact, when most people described Cindy when she was living in Shenandoah, they would talk about her laughter, because 1, she seemed to always be laughing and smiling, and 2, because her laughter was incredibly infectious, and anyone who heard it couldn't help but laugh themselves. But the Bortons' seemingly perfect life would go off the rails in 1987, 5 years after the Bortons had arrived in Shenandoah. That summer, Robert's church, which had been struggling financially for years, was finally forced to shut their doors, and so Robert's job was gone, and so too was his main source of income. This loss was devastating both emotionally and financially for the Borton family. By September of the following year, 1988, Robert had not had any luck finding another pastor gig in town or nearby, and the income they were making between Robert's car dealership work and Cindy's various part-time jobs was just not enough, and so the couple began talking about relocating. However, they both loved Shenandoah, it was their home, and John, who was 18 at the time, he was about to start his senior year in high school, and so they really didn't want to pull him out until he was done. And so Cindy and Robert decided that they would just stay in Shenandoah and they would weather the financial storm they were in, and then maybe after John graduated from high school, they would think about moving. But when John's senior year actually began that September, the Bortons' 18-year-old son suddenly developed a serious case of senioritis, meaning he didn't want to go to school. And on the morning of Tuesday, September 6th, just a few days into the new school year, John walked into the family kitchen and announced to his mother that he did not want to go to school ever. Cindy had to argue with John all by herself because Robert had already left that morning for work. But luckily, John eventually just gave up because he knew his mother was not going to budge. She wanted him to go to school. And so, begrudgingly, John ate his breakfast, he gathered up his backpack, and he followed his mother out to her car that was parked in the driveway. On the drive to school, Cindy reminded her son that she'd be working at the donut shop that afternoon, and so he'd have to walk home. When they arrived at Shenandoah High School a few minutes later, John, who was still very annoyed with his mother for forcing him to go to school that day, he got out and he slammed the car door before mumbling a barely audible goodbye to his mother. As Cindy drove the short distance back to their house, she tried to tell herself that, John's behavior was just typical teenage behavior, and once the school year really got going, John's attitude would surely improve. Still, it was something she intended to talk to Robert about when he came home that afternoon for his lunch break. Once Cindy was back at their home, she parked the car in the driveway and walked through the back door and down the short hallway into the kitchen. After cleaning up the breakfast dishes, she caught up on a few household chores and made sure that the clothes she planned to wear to work that afternoon were clean and ready to go. Then she glanced at her watch and headed back into the kitchen to heat up some spaghetti sauce and pasta for lunch with Robert. Right at 12 p.m. that afternoon, just a half mile away, Robert would tell his boss that he was headed home for his 1-hour-long lunch break. A few minutes later, Robert pulled his pickup truck into the driveway of his modest little house, he turned off the engine, and he walked up the steps to the front door. As he stepped into their small living room, he called out to let Cindy know that he was home. After she called back to him from the kitchen, Robert went to the first-floor bathroom to wash up before he too headed into the kitchen to join his wife. As Cindy served him a hot plate of spaghetti, Robert listened as Cindy told him about how John had not wanted to go to school that morning and how upset he was when she dropped him off. And Robert would agree with his wife that, this did seem like typical teenage behavior and that, probably as the school year wore on, his attitude would change. The pair would chat about John's behavior for the bulk of their meal, and then at about 12:45, Robert put his dishes in the sink, he thanked Cindy for his lunch, and then he told her he'd see her that afternoon after she got home from her shift at the donut shop. A few minutes after Robert had left the house to return to work, Cindy was already washing the lunch dishes when she heard a knock on the back door. She glanced at her watch and wondered who would be visiting her in the middle of the day. A little over an hour later, at around 2 p.m., Robert received a call at the car dealership where he worked. When his boss handed him the phone, Robert heard the voice of Cindy's coworker at the donut shop. Sue Rogers told him that Cindy had not shown up for work, which was unlike her since she usually arrived for her shift early. Sue had tried calling the Borton house, but no one had picked up. Robert told Sue that, maybe Cindy had taken a nap after lunch and she's just overslept. An hour later, at 3 p.m., Robert got another call from the donut shop. This time, Sue sounded worried. Cindy still had not shown up for work, and a coworker who went by the Borton house had stopped at the back door to call out for Cindy, but didn't get an answer. And they noticed that the door was open. But this coworker didn't want to go inside without being invited, and so they left. Robert called home, and when Cindy did not pick up the phone, he asked his boss if he could leave work to go check on his wife. Just after 3:30 p.m., Robert pulled up to his house, and the first thing he noticed was that Cindy's car was still in the driveway. After parking his truck just behind her car, Robert walked up to the front door and let himself in, calling out his wife's name as soon as he stepped inside. When there was no answer, Robert began walking from the living room where he came in at the front of the house toward the back of the house where the kitchen was. As he walked, he kept yelling out for Cindy, but it was silent. When Robert finally reached the kitchen and got a view of the kitchen, he came to a complete and sudden stop. Backing slowly away, Robert reached for a nearby phone on the wall and he called 911. When they picked up, he would tell police to come to his house right away because his wife had had a terrible accident. After hanging up the phone, Robert grabbed the family dog's collar off of a nearby hook, and he put it on the dog and led the dog outside to the backyard where he tied the dog up, and then Robert walked around the outside of the house to the driveway in front, where he leaned against the side of Cindy's car, and there he waited patiently for the police to arrive. When the local police and ambulance arrived at the Borton house a few minutes later, Robert stepped forward to meet them. Then he stayed outside while the police and the medical technicians entered the front door and made their way into the kitchen and back. What they saw inside was so shocking and so gruesome that the chief of police, Richard Hunt, he knew this was not a crime or a crime scene that his local police force could handle. He needed serious help from the state, and he needed that help right away. The kitchen was covered in blood, and lying on her back in the middle of the floor was Cindy Borton. She had been stabbed 29 times with various bloody weapons that were found near her body on the ground. Based on the sheer violence of the attack and the fact that the back door had been unlocked and undamaged, Chief Hunt was sure that this crime had been personal. He knew the crime statistics in Iowa. 85% of all homicides in the state were committed by people and family members who were close to the victim, which meant that right away, Cindy's husband, Robert, and her son, John, were at the top of the list of potential suspects. And so as Chief Hunt and the rest of the local police force more or less waited for the state law enforcement to arrive so they could actually begin processing the scene, Chief Hunt decided to just go outside and speak with Robert. And so he went outside, he walked down the front steps, and he made his way over to Robert, who was still near Cindy's car. And Chief Hunt would ask him, "Robert, do you have any idea who could have done this to your wife?" After Robert said, no, he didn't, the police chief was shocked when Cindy's husband went on to insist that his wife's death must have been an accident. But before the chief could continue questioning Robert, they were interrupted by the arrival of the Borton family's son, John, who was walking down the road towards the family house on his way home from school. John slowed down as he approached the house and took in the sight of the police cars and an ambulance parked along the curb and the yellow crime scene tape along the perimeter of their yard. When John reached his father, Robert told him that something bad had happened to his mother and that she was dead. But as Robert reached out to put his hands on his son's shoulders, John dropped his backpack and just turned around and started running. Later, he would tell law enforcement that the news was so shocking he just couldn't handle it, and so that's why he ran. When John did return to his house almost 2 hours later, personnel from the state's Division of Criminal Investigation had finally arrived, and they were dusting for fingerprints and gathering evidence inside of the Borton house. And local law enforcement had fanned out around the neighborhood to ask the Borton's neighbors if they had seen anything unusual or suspicious that day. By then, Robert had also told police exactly what he had done that day, starting with him leaving the house at 6:45 a.m. to go to work, and then arriving at work at 7 a.m., and then coming home again at noon for lunch with Cindy, and then leaving again and getting back to the car dealership at 1 p.m. Robert also described the calls he got from the donut shop saying that Cindy had not shown up for her 2 p.m. shift, and he would describe to police what it was like when he arrived at his house at 3:30 p.m. to check to see if Cindy was okay. After John was back at the house, he would tell police that he had been at school from the time his mother had dropped him off in the morning until school let out at 3:30, and then he had walked home. When the state investigators asked John if anything about that morning had seemed out of the ordinary, at first John said no, but then after a few seconds, he changed his answer to yes. He said that he and his mother had been arguing that morning because John didn't want to go to school that day, but he told police this was not anything serious. By the time John and Robert left the Borton property to go stay that night with friends that they knew from Robert's old church, word had spread throughout Shenandoah that something unspeakable had happened to one of the town's most popular residents. Early the next morning on September 7th, there were police officers waiting at Robert's car dealership to check on Robert's alibi. And while Robert's timesheet confirmed the timeline Robert had given them, Robert's boss added one detail about that day that Robert had left out. When Robert arrived back at the dealership after his lunch break, he had apparently changed his clothes. When asked if that was unusual, his boss would say, "Not really." Robert's boss would say that on Tuesdays, the car dealership's commercial cleaning service would come by to pick up dirty uniforms and rags, and so Robert's boss thought that, maybe Robert had come to work that day in his work clothes, he had gotten a full morning of work in, and then when he went home for lunch, he had changed, and then when he had come back, maybe he had dropped off those dirty clothes from the morning with the cleaning service. While this seemed totally plausible, investigators couldn't help but think that if Robert was involved in the murder of his wife, and if there was any evidence from the murder on those work clothes, well, that evidence was now being destroyed by a commercial washing machine. Meanwhile, investigators who had arrived at Shenandoah High School early that morning to check John's alibi also had some questions. It would turn out John's alibi was not as straightforward as he had made it seem. His teachers at his high school told police that yes, John had come to school the previous day, but he did not have any classes between 1 and 3 p.m., and no one could really verify his whereabouts at that time, and it just so happens that that was likely the time frame when his mother was killed. And later that afternoon, a neighbor would tell police that they had seen a teenager running through the Bortons' backyard around the time that Cindy would have been killed. The neighbor couldn't give police much of a description of this teenager, except to say that the teenager was a boy and that he had a thin build and it looked like his hair was brown, which was basically a perfect description of John. And so, 2 days after Cindy's death, detectives brought John into the police station for questioning. When pressed about the 1 to 3 p.m. gap in his alibi, John would adamantly state that he never left school grounds during that time period. He said he had been at school all day from the time his mother dropped him off until he walked home and discovered the police and ambulances in front of his house. When asked about his parents' relationship, John admitted that there was some tension there and that sometimes he heard his parents arguing, mostly about money. But John also told police that his mother and father were very committed to each other and had been quite happy in the past. And so no matter what problems they might be having, John was confident that his parents were not even close to getting divorced. He believed they would look to find a solution that kept them together. As for his own relationship with his mother, John told police that his mother had been everything to him and that it totally crushed him that his last interaction with her was that stupid fight about him not wanting to go to school. Despite Robert and John continuing to deny that they had anything to do with the murder, 48 hours into the investigation, the father and son were still the prime suspects. 3 days after Cindy's murder, on September 9th, the results of her autopsy came back. Based on the fact that the spaghetti she had eaten for lunch on the day of her murder was completely undigested, police were able to narrow the time of her death down to about 1 p.m. Meanwhile, investigators questioning teachers and students at Shenandoah High School were starting to believe that John had been telling the truth, that he really had been on school grounds on the day of the murder from 1 to 3 p.m. At Cindy's memorial service on September 13th, 6 days after her murder, investigators were waiting outside the church. Before scratching John off of their suspect list, they wanted to talk with John's best friend, Jim Bettis, to see if he could offer any additional insights into John's relationship with his mother. Jim had been a frequent visitor at the Borton household, and since Cindy's death, he had been spending a lot of time with John, comforting him. And so police were hopeful that if John was involved, maybe Jim would have picked up on it and maybe Jim would be willing to talk about it. But according to Jim, there really were no problems between John and his mother. He said John loved his mother and that he would never hurt her. And as for that fight that they got in over John going to school or not that morning, Jim said that was totally insignificant and not a reflection of John and Cindy's actual relationship. After speaking with Jim and a few other friends of John's that came out of the memorial service, investigators felt satisfied that John really was not involved, and so they crossed his name off the suspect list. So with no other new leads and no further information on any teenager running across the Borton's yard on the afternoon of the murder, investigators were now sure that the killer had to be Cindy's husband, Robert. So, about 1 week after the murder, investigators brought Robert into the interrogation room in the basement of the local police station, and then once he was sitting down, a special agent from the state's Division of Criminal Investigation leaned in close to Robert and said, "Bob, let's quit playing games. We both know Cindy was dead when you went back to work." But for the next 3 hours, Robert, who showed very little emotion and no signs of grief, refused to change his story. He said he had nothing to do with his wife's murder. He said that Cindy had seemed totally normal when he left for work early on the morning of the day she died, and when he came home for lunch that day at noon, she was alive. And she was also still alive when he left to go back to work at 12:45 p.m. Before leaving the police station, Robert agreed to have his fingerprints collected, and he agreed to take a lie detector test. So, the very next day, a special agent drove Robert 150 miles northeast to Des Moines, where Robert was hooked up to a polygraph machine that would measure his physical reactions to a series of key questions. Questions like, "Did you hurt your wife?" or "Did you kill your wife?" And Robert would answer these questions the same way he had the day before in the basement interrogation room at the police station. "No, I didn't hurt my wife. No, I didn't kill my wife." But this time, the polygraph machine showed that Robert was not being truthful. He didn't fail his test by much, but the results convinced investigators that despite Robert's denials, he must be the killer. And so the agent who had administered the lie detector test pulled Robert aside for another round of intense questioning, telling him, "Hey, you failed this test, so you got to tell us the truth now." But Robert continued to say that he had nothing to do with it, and he even fell asleep during this interrogation. Even with this failed lie detector test, the police lacked hard evidence that linked Robert to the murder. And so even though they wanted to keep him, they couldn't. They had to let him go. And so a special agent drove Robert back to Shenandoah, and on the drive, he turned to Robert and he said, "You know, Bob, when this is all over and you've been arrested, charged, tried, and convicted, I would be honored if you confessed to me." But a week later, 2.5 weeks after Cindy's murder, investigators got another piece of bad news when the state's crime lab reported that they had not been able to lift any fingerprints from the various murder weapons that had been found in Cindy's kitchen. They also were unable to pull any prints off of any other physical evidence that had been sent off for testing. As September inched towards October, and police had still not made any arrests, the residents of Shenandoah were outraged and scared. Every day they called the police station and the mayor's office seeking updates, and local gun stores reported a serious uptick in sales. And in November, Robert, who was being questioned by police nearly every day and was being shunned by residents who now walked across the street to avoid talking with him, he packed up the family's belongings and moved with John to the town of Gladbrook, just outside of Des Moines, where he and Cindy had actually gotten married. Around this time, local reporters began asking the question that was on everyone's mind. How was it possible that in a town as small as Shenandoah, police could not figure out who had committed such a heinous crime? And on top of having a murderer on the loose, Shenandoah also had an arsonist on the loose. Around the time Cindy was killed, someone had been intentionally setting fires around town, damaging an elementary school, as well as destroying a pickup truck. And while the arson attacks didn't appear to be connected to Cindy's murder, it did seem odd that there would be two violent crimes happening at the same time in a town that saw almost zero violent crime. And so some investigators began to suspect, just because of the rarity of violent crime, that the arson attacks and the murder had to be connected. And on November 30th of that year, their suspicions seemed to be confirmed. On that day, there was an arson attack at Shenandoah City Hall, except this time, the arsonist left behind a note. On this note, the arsonist warned police that the school fire and the truck fire and the murder of Cindy Borton were nothing compared to what was coming next. At the end of this note, the arsonist identified themselves as, quote, the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker was the name of a notorious murderer in California who had been captured 3 years earlier. But what really caught the attention of law enforcement was the fact that whoever had signed the note also left behind a fingerprint at the very bottom of the piece of paper the note was written on. While investigators waited on the results of the fingerprint analysis, they returned to the scenes of the earlier arson attacks, and on a bridge near the school fire, police had found the letters NS painted on a concrete support. They believed these had to be the initials of the Night Stalker. By early December, the mayor of Shenandoah had received more than 200 calls from terrified residents demanding that the police find the arsonist/killer before they murdered anyone else. But the Night Stalker lead came to an abrupt end a few weeks later when the fingerprint analysis not only failed to match Richard Borton's fingerprints, it didn't match any prints on file in any local, state, or federal law enforcement database. So unfortunately, both the arson cases and the murder case began to grow cold. It wasn't until 5 months after Cindy Borton's murder that local and state investigators would get the tip they needed to break the murder and arson cases wide open. Around dinner time on the cloudy, cool night of January 30th, 1989, the Shenandoah police chief, Richard Hunt, got a call from one of his officers. There was a teenager who had just walked into the police station, and he wanted to talk with someone about the murder of Cindy Borton. A few minutes later, Chief Hunt was sitting in his office looking across his desk at 18-year-old Jack Johnson, one of John Borton's best friends and classmates, and one of the boys investigators had talked with back in September when they were confirming John's alibi for the time of his mother's murder. Jack told Chief Hunt that a few days earlier, on January 26th, Jack had been talking to someone, and during their conversation, Jack had asked this person what was the worst thing they had ever done. And this person paused for a moment, and then they said to Jack, "I've done something that I'm pretty sure God will never forgive me for." Jack would go on to tell police all the awful details of what this person claimed to have done that God would not forgive them for. Based on Jack's testimony, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to Cindy Borden. Back on the day that Cindy died, September 6th, 1988, she and her husband Robert were sitting in the kitchen eating spaghetti and talking about their son's recent bad behavior. After Robert was done eating, he put his dirty dishes in the sink, he thanked his wife for the food, and then he headed out the door to go back to work. As Cindy began washing the dishes, she heard a knock on the back door. Glancing at her watch, she saw it was already almost 1 p.m., which meant she didn't really have a lot of time to visit with whoever this was before she had to step away and get ready for her 2 p.m. shift at the donut shop. And so feeling a little bit flustered, Cindy turned off the faucet and she dried her hands, and then she walked around the counter and she walked down the very short hallway that led to the back door of the house. And as she walked down this hallway, she looked through the glass of the back door and she saw who her visitor was. And even though she was pressed for time, she couldn't help herself. She smiled. She was happy to see him. However, she was a little bit concerned that her visitor was not in school. But she opened the door, and as soon as the door was open, her visitor immediately reassured her that he understood he was supposed to be in school and he'd be there soon. He was just stopping by because he was hoping that Cindy wouldn't mind being a reference for a job that he was going to be applying for. And so Cindy said, "Yeah, of course I'll be a reference for your new job. I'd love to hear about your new job. Come inside, let's talk about it." And so her visitor stepped inside, and as they walked down the little hallway towards the kitchen, the visitor asked Cindy if it was okay if she got him a glass of water because he was really thirsty. And so Cindy said, "Yeah, no problem. Come in the kitchen, I'll get you water, and we can talk about this new job." And so they start walking down this hallway, and the visitor reaches into his pocket and he unfolds his pocket knife. And right as Cindy is stepping into the kitchen with her back to him, he walks up behind her, he reaches around the front of her neck, and he digs the blade into the front of her throat, cutting her neck wide open. Cindy instinctively reached up and tried to grab her neck to protect herself, but her attacker grabbed her hands, pulled them away, and then with the knife, he dug another trench across her throat. And then the attacker backed up a couple of steps. Cindy, who was now pouring blood out of her neck, stumbled forward into the kitchen, and then she whipped around, clutching her throat, looking at her attacker. It was 18-year-old Jim Bettis, her son's best friend. But she didn't have time to process who was attacking her, because before long, as she was staring at him, he lunged at her again, slashing and cutting her. And so she put her hands up over her face to protect herself, and he was digging the knife over and over again into her forearms and her hands and all over her body. And eventually she kind of slumped onto the kitchen counter after being stabbed and cut so many times, at which point Jim walked away from her and he walked over to a drawer that he knew from all of the visits he had made to this household to visit with John. He knew that in this drawer were kitchen knives and other utensils. And so as Cindy is laying right near him up against the counter, pleading with him to stop, and she's bleeding everywhere, he reaches into this drawer and he pulls out 2 of Cindy's sharpest knives and he sets them on the counter, and then he pulls out 2 long serving forks that each had very pointed prongs at the end. And so he turns around to look at Cindy, and Cindy sees what he's doing, and so she tries to make a run for the phone to call 911. But before she could get there, Jim grabbed the 2 knives that he had just taken out of the drawer, and he leapt in front of Cindy and began stabbing her over and over and over again on her sides, her front, her face, her hands, her legs, anywhere he could, he would stab her. And Cindy the whole time is trying to hit him and push him back, but there's nothing she can do. She's helpless. And then at some point she kind of falls to the ground, but she's not dead yet. And so at that point, Jim put down the 2 knives he had just taken out of that drawer, and he went back and he got the 2 serving forks. And then he went back over to Cindy, who was now crawling across the ground trying to get to the phone, and he began stabbing her in the back of the neck, on the side, over and over and over again. Despite multiple puncture wounds to her vital organs, Cindy was not dying. She was bleeding profusely. She was likely mortally wounded at this point, but she kept trying to move forward. She kept trying to fight back. She was doing anything she could to save herself. But eventually, Jim overpowered her. He flipped her over onto her back. And then kneeling next to her, he got his tools lined up next to him, the 2 knives, his own knife, and the 2 serving forks. and systematically he began using these tools to begin cutting and slashing and digging into the front of her torso. And he would continue to do that until Cindy finally stopped moving. And when she did stop moving, he picked up one of the serving forks, he raised it up over his head, and then he brought it straight down into her neck, plunging it deep inside of her. And then he let go of the handle, leaving the fork stuck into her neck. Then he wiped off the handle of that fork as well as the other handles of the other murder weapons, which he just left on the floor next to Cindy, with the exception of his folding knife. He would take that. Then Jim stood up and walked into the small bathroom near the kitchen, and he washed his hands and face, leaving faint traces of blood in the sink, but wiping his fingerprints from the faucet handles. Then Jim retraced his steps to the back door. He stepped outside and he paused for just a minute before taking off at a run across the Bortons' yard. He would be seen by that neighbor, except the neighbor would only be able to describe him as a thin teenager with brown hair. 3 hours later, Jim and his parents would be out driving around when they passed John, who had just bolted from the scene and the news of his mother's death. Jim's parents slowed the car down, and Jim leaned out the window and he comforted his friend, asking him if he wanted to come into the car and talk about what happened. Did he need a ride anywhere? But John, who was in a state of shock, would just shake his head and keep on running. 5 months after killing his best friend's mother, Jim would confess his crime to his other best friend, Jack Johnson. Not only would Jim tell Jack exactly where he had disposed of his pocket knife, he would also draw a diagram for Jack showing him exactly where Jim had left Cindy's body inside the Bortons' kitchen. On the night of January 30th, which was the day that Jack Johnson had gone to police to tell them about Jim, he presented Jim's hand-drawn diagram and pushed it across the desk to Chief Hunt. On February 2nd, 1989, police asked Jim Bettis to come to the police station for an interview. Once inside the interrogation room, Jim denied everything, saying he had never had that conversation with Jack Johnson. But after agreeing to let police collect his fingerprints, police determined Jim's prints matched the one found on the note left by the Night Stalker. After another round of questioning, Jim eventually admitted to being the arsonist, but it wasn't until he conclusively and massively failed his polygraph test that he would admit to police that, yes, he had killed Cindy Borton. It would turn out Jim had nothing against Cindy. The person he really hated was his own father. According to Jim, his father had spent years deriding and criticizing him. For a while, Jim had taken out his anger by setting fires around town, but for the last several months, he'd come to despise his father so much that all Jim could think about was killing him. But Jim was afraid of his father and couldn't really imagine himself besting his father in any kind of physical confrontation. And Jim wasn't even sure he could go through with killing anyone. So he decided what he needed to do was practice. He needed to find someone who would be easy to kill, someone vulnerable, someone who trusted him, someone who loved him. And the one person who fit that bill was his best friend's mother, Cindy Borton. As far back as Jim could remember, Cindy had been the one person he knew who was always glad to see him, and who always had time to talk with him, and who always offered him encouragement. She would be the last person to suspect that he could ever hurt her. And so he told himself, if he could kill Cindy, maybe he could also kill his father. The police were able to finally prove their case against Jim when they found his pocket knife that he had tossed under a local bridge. The knife still had Cindy's blood on it, along with Jim's fingerprints. On November 13th, 1989, Jim Bettis, who was 19 years old at the time, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In a letter Jim wrote from prison, he told a relative that when he, quote, killed that lady, I guess I went too far and pretended that she was my dad. By 1990, 2 years after Cindy's murder, Robert and John had moved again, this time to Eldora, Iowa, a town of 3,000 residents located about 3.5 hours northeast of Shenandoah. Robert would remarry, and he would find work at a plastics recycling plant. State and local law enforcement in Shenandoah defended the intensive investigation techniques they used with Robert, saying that from the start, he was their only viable suspect. Now, 52 years old, Cindy's son John wants people to remember his mother for her life, not her death. He would tell reporters in April of 2022 that she was a wonderful, wonderful person, and I only miss her on days that end in the letter Y. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to water the 5-star review button's favorite flowers while they're gone on vacation. But instead of watering them, give them no water and leave them in the blazing sun. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen,